Good morning, everybody. It is 7 o'clock. You are very welcome to join us on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News this Monday morning. Mainland China has seen its biggest protest since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. Seething anger and resentment at the government's zero-COVID policy has spilled out onto the streets in cities right across the country. One of the triggers was images of crowds at the World Cup not wearing masks, which show how the rest of the world has moved on from lockdown and restrictions. Also this morning, reports back here that the army could be drafted in to fill frontline roles in hospitals to help support a strike-hit NHS. Speaking to the Business Secretary Grant Shapps and the unions later this hour. It is Monday, the 28th of November. Sky News witnesses more arrests this morning as the Chinese Communist Party attempt to contain the biggest challenge to its authority in more than a generation.
The arrests happened here in Shanghai, where people have been openly critical of the government. Many have told us they want their freedoms back.
Preparing to send in the army, military personnel could drive ambulances and fill frontline roles in hospitals during strikes.
We're set to find out this week if thousands of paramedics will go on strike, joining cleaners, porters and pharmacy technicians.
Good morning from Qatar, where we'll have the very latest as England and Wales are in final preparations before their crucial match tomorrow.
Out of the jungle and heading home, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock faces questions about his political future after he finishes third on I'm a Celebrity.
Hello, folks.
Hi, Bob.
Not too bad. Unfortunately, you guys are all going to have to walk to the venue.
Is it far?
Is it what?
Is it far?
I don't know, but it's better.
Busted on their way to the ball, how police caught 20 people in black tie in the back of a horse box. And a Jurassic attraction, a replica of what could have been the largest animal ever to walk the earth, is to go on display at the Natural History Museum. Morning, everyone. Protesters in Shanghai have chanted down with the Chinese Communist Party and free the people. Anger and resentment over the country's zero-COVID policy has provoked the biggest protest since the 1980s in cities right across China. This morning, there are more people on the streets and there have been more arrests witnessed by our own team. Let's get more, should we? Helen Ann is standing by for us in Shanghai. What's going on, Helen Ann? Good morning.
Good morning, Kay. Well, if the atmosphere in the city last night was emotional and angry, the atmosphere in the city this morning is very, very tense indeed. We're actually broadcasting to you from quite a few roads away, actually, from where the main site of the protests were last night and the night before. We were over there this morning, and frankly, it's just not safe for us to broadcast live from there right now. The second we pulled the camera up, police immediately on us, immediately following us. There have been a lot of arrests over the last couple of days. We actually witnessed one person being dragged away by police from that very sort of high-tension hotspot, if you like. We weren't really sure what it is he had done, perhaps just linger a little too long. And there have been multiple foreign journalists arrested as well in the last couple of days. So a very, very tense atmosphere. But worth saying, there were young people going to that crossroads where people have been gathering over the last couple of days. They weren't making it obvious that they were there to protest, but I think it was pretty clear to everyone that that is why they had gone there. But what has been seen across China over the last couple of days is really quite extraordinary, incredibly rare. And these are the scenes we witnessed last night in Shanghai. As night fell in Shanghai, they gathered in their hundreds. Ordinary, angry people facing up to the authorities. They stood largely in silence. Words can be dangerous here, but there was a power in them being withheld. Their presence alone spoke volumes. The roads are completely blocked here by police, but that hasn't stopped hundreds of other people gathering here, holding up signs, white pieces of paper that's becoming a real symbol of the protests here. It's hard to express just how incredibly unusual these scenes are in China. The catalyst for this rage is a fire on the other side of this vast country. COVID rules allegedly trapped those inside. 10 lost their lives. The final straw, it seems, for many, in a zero-COVID pressure cooker. Among the crowd, we met this group of young friends, brimming with passion and incredibly brave.
我们需要就是希望有更多人就是勇敢的、坚强的站出来对抗他们，这是我们的目的。在昨天我们在乌鲁木齐中路的时候，有很多同胞，因为我们说了实话，他们不开心了，他们就把我们抓走了。我们要求他们放人，但他们无动于衷，他们不把人民当人民。
People spontaneously applauded her for speaking and chanted, "Free the people." There's a sense that people are really angry. Is that right?
People are really upset. It's not really like we're angry because it's our countries.
Our interview was suddenly cut short by this.
To the left, to the left.
Keep going. The police charging, arresting. Everyone who could ran. Go. Gradually, police pushed the crowds back and back, but they did not disperse. The thing that makes protests like what we saw last night as extraordinary as they are is not just the openness with which people are calling for things like the downfall of the government. That is almost unheard of here. But it is also the fact that similar protests have been springing up in multiple cities simultaneously. And that has not happened for many decades in this country. And I cannot overstate enough just how extremely risky it was for every single person that went to that protest last night. They were taking enormous personal risks to be there, and the fact they were out in such numbers with such bravery really was extraordinary. So all eyes on what happens next, whether there will be repeats of protests both here in Shanghai tonight and in other cities. It's not clear yet. What does feel likely in this city is that if there are more gatherings, they will be clamped down on much more swiftly and potentially much more aggressively. That's how it feels right now. But the Communist Party of China faces a huge dilemma now. What to do? Whether to crack down heavily and militarily, whether to offer some concessions, whether to draw back some of those COVID rules that people are so weary over. That poses risks for them, not least of a big COVID outbreak, the thing they want to avoid, but also sending a message to people that protests work, something they would also want to avoid. So the next 24, 48 hours or so, I think, really pivotal for this country that is already experiencing a historic period.
OK, for now, thanks so much indeed. Back home, the army could be brought in to drive ambulances and stand in for frontline hospital roles under emergency plans to deal with possible strikes this winter. Let's get more with Sadia, who's standing by for us at St Thomas's Hospital, just across the river here in central London this morning. So it's not yet been confirmed, but it is suggested that the army could get involved if necessary. Good morning.
Morning, Kay. No, it hasn't been confirmed and there hasn't been a formal request made by the Department for Health to the Ministry of Defence, but it's all about contingency plans. So the Army is looking at contingency plans and the government is also looking at contingency plans. And one of those things is a protocol called MACA, which stands for Military Aid for Civil Authorities. And all of that is aimed at making sure that the NHS continues its service if strike action is as bad as health leaders fear that it could be. Now, anyone who remembers the last time the ambulance drivers went on strike late 1989 to early 1990 may recall seeing the Army, the Navy, even the Royal Air Force getting involved in trying to transport patients while those drivers were on strike. And of course, we've seen the Army in more recent days during the pandemic when they set up mobile testing units for COVID testing and delivered PPE. But it is one thing to have the Army deployed during a pandemic and quite something else to see soldiers on the streets during normal times. But it just goes to show the sort of expectation of the stresses that the NHS might come under this winter. And it's not just ambulance drivers, of course, who are set to go on strike. Last week, the Royal College of Nursing announced that its members across England, Wales and Northern Ireland will go on strike on December 15th and 20th. We know that hospital cleaners, porters, pharmacy technicians, midwives, junior doctors, all of them considering strike action. The government is looking at ways that it can try and convince these workers that it is aware of the difficult conditions that they work in. Some of the things that they're considering are things like free coffee, free breakfast, free parking, a very contentious issue so far. All these things that they're looking at to try and convince workers that they do care. But new pay packages aren't being considered because the Treasury is adamant that that would just fuel inflation.
OK, thanks a lot. Let's talk about it in more detail. Kevin Warren, Head of Public Services at the Trade Union Congress, is with us now. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme.
Good morning, Kate.
Does it sit right with you that armed forces personnel could be working in our hospitals?
Well, I think it doesn't sit right with me that hundreds of thousands of health workers are feeling so pressed and hard done to in terms of pay over, let's face it, the last 10, 12 years, that the only thing that they feel they can do to try and get the government to listen to them is to take industrial action. I mean, years and years of having pay settlements below inflation has made them so desperate that they're taking industrial action. It's it's a real blight on this government, really, that we've got to this stage.
90% pay rise, we're being told, is what nurses want, effectively. Can anybody justify 19% increase in their salary at the present time?
Well, that reflects the fact that there have been years of below inflation pay rises, and in real terms, nurses are about £5,000 a year worse off than they were in 2010. So the logic, if you like, of that pay claim is there for everyone to see. Nurses, health workers, right across, ambulance drivers, and the whole list of workers that your report has just outlined are all that much worse off in real terms. That kind of pay claim just brings them back to the levels of pay that in real terms that they were experiencing in 2010. It doesn't seem right to me that we praise our health service so highly, that we clap for them through the pandemic, and yet in real terms they're so much worse off that they feel that the only course of action that they can take is to push back and demand a really significant pay rise through industrial action.
Yeah, but I mean, the country's not got any money at the moment, has it?
Well, the government would like you to believe this is an economic choice, but it's a political choice. If they were to tax capital gains and inheritance tax at the same rate of income tax, then there'd be enough money to pay every single health worker that pay rise, but they're choosing to tax workers and not to tax wealth. So these are political decisions that the government is making. There is, resources available. They're just not choosing to bring them to the table.
The government would say in response to that, I suppose, that it's a fine line between taxing those that are more wealthy and taxing them, those wealth creators, to the extent that they decide to go and take their finances elsewhere in this global economy.
It is a balance, absolutely. No one's going to push back on that. But the fact is, shareholder dividends have been rising 3 times faster than wages in the economy. So there is a balance to be struck, but the balance at the moment seems to very much favour wealth in the country, and very much damage and harm working people who we all rely on. And the balance has been so bad that, I say, workers are feeling so desperate that they're taking the action that they're taking.
Could the TUC afford to pay its staff an extra 19% this year?
Well, it's not the same scenario. Our staff haven't had years and years of below inflation pay rises. So we have a good relationship with our trade unions, and we work out what we can afford to pay our staff, and we pay them well. Public sector workers are literally rocking up at food banks because they're been so squeezed for so many years.
Yeah, but I suppose my question is, could you afford to pay an extra 19% if that was being asked this year?
Well,
or is the business in such a state that actually you can't do that at the moment?
Well, what the TUC and all of our trade unions have never said is that employers shouldn't pay unaffordable pay rises where private sector employers can afford to pay rises. They are doing in many cases, and so they should. The difference between, if you like, the private sector and organisations like the TUC and public sector is that it's the government's choices that are impacting on those wages, and the government are choosing to not tax capital wealth, and they are choosing to tax working people and keep working people, hard pressed. That's a political choice. It's different to the one that private sector organisations are having to make.
Government Minister on Sky yesterday said that 19% is unaffordable. From what you're saying, you say that's not the case, and the NHS can afford to pay nurses 19% more this year.
I'm saying that the government are making political choices in order to, favour the wealth in this country and put pressure on working people. If the government were to introduce capital gains and inheritance tax at the same rate as income tax, they will be able to afford to pay nurses an inflation-busting pay rise. Absolutely, they would.
Do you think that it's affordable for the NHS this year to pay 19%, given where we are?
Well, I'm not in the negotiations with NHS employers.
Well, you're here representing the TUC today, and that in turn represents the unions.
And what I'm saying to you is that if the government had a fairer tax system, the NHS would absolutely be able to afford to pay its workers.
Yeah, but we've just seen the autumn budget. We're not going to get another autumn statement, or we're not probably going to get anything until at least the spring. So given where we are, you're saying that the NHS can still afford to pay 19% to nurses as we speak, and if they don't get it, they're going to go on strike. It seems like the British public is caught between a rock and a hard place.
Well, the British public are absolutely being caught between a rock and a hard place. The people who can move that rock or move that hard place are the government by making different choices on taxation.
This strike ballot with ambulance workers, England and Wales, and we're expecting that later on in the week, the results of that. How do you expect that to go?
Well, from what I hear, the anger that's right across the health service, right across education and many public services and parts of the private sector economy is that people feel that they've got no choice but to stand up together to try and push back against the pay deals that they've got. So I would expect those ballots to be in favour of industrial action, and it's a really, very sad situation that workers feel so bad that they have to take that action.
And do you think that military personnel can do as good a job as the ambulancemen and women?
Well, I doubt it, to be frank. I mean, these are professionals who have been working very hard in the sector and very well trained for such a long time. It's, there is life and limb cover as well, arrangements in place across the health service, of course. But no one would expect the army to do the same quality of job as professional paramedics and ambulance staff.
So you have to accept that patients' lives will be put at risk.
Well, as I say, our unions have got life and limb cover arrangements in place across the health service. Nobody wants to do this in order to damage patient care. That all of the people I've ever come across in the NHS are incredible, committed professionals. They just feel so desperate that they have to take this action. But there is life and limb cover in place, and people will obviously be very conscious of the impact and risk of the action that they're taking.
Okay, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you. So waiting to hear what's going to happen as far as the ambulance service is concerned. Also, the nurses going on strike, the postmen on strike, the rail workers are on strike. 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, joined by union leaders to answer your questions as the country faces a wave of strikes not seen in a generation. You can tweet me at Kay Burley with your questions. Those questions can be in written form. If you prefer, you can send us a short video, and also we'll have an email address that you can send it to as well. So that's Thursday at 9 o'clock. Ask the union leaders. Do you have a question for the unions? Do you support their action, or do you feel that it will impair your ability to go about your everyday work? Do let us know your thoughts. Tweet me directly at Kay Burley. Use the hashtag Kay Burley, or you can email us and I'll let you have that email address in the fullness of time. In a few moments, joined by the Business Secretary, that's Grant Shapps, of course, Also speaking to the former Brexit Secretary David Davis as he calls on the PM to enact emergency legislation to help reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel in small boats. And Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, that's Jonathan Reynolds, will be with me soon after 8 o'clock. Well, lots to talk to Grant Shapps about this morning. Hello to you, Mr. Shapps. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Let's start with the unions, should we? Just finishing there. How are you feeling about the possibility that the military is going to be brought in to fill the gap should ambulance workers go on strike?
Yeah, I saw that story. I don't think that's actually correct, other than to say that the government always looks at contingency plans, but there aren't any immediate plans to do that. And actually, the NHS has got some pretty well-versed planning in place for all manner of disruption. Of course, ideally, I'd love to see those strikes averted. I don't think anyone wants to see strikes in our NHS. It harms everybody and it's to no one's advantage.
OK. Are nurses worth a 19% pay rise?
Well, we followed, it's worth saying we followed the NHS pay review body when it comes to nurses, which I think is a £1,400 pay rise this year. It comes on top of, I think, 3% last year when inflation was lower and there were a lot of freezes elsewhere. But, you know, I'll leave it to the experts on this. I think the main message to everybody is we don't want to see strikes in our NHS. You know, we will rely on it and we want to see it functioning normally.
The chap who's now doing your former job, Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, is saying we can't afford a 10% pay rise, an inflation-busting pay rise for anybody. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen how this works before. You have to go back several decades, but high inflation, if you then feed the high inflation with high settlements, you end up in a spiral where it never ends. And that's what happened in the 1970s. We're very determined not to be in that situation now. It won't benefit anybody. We all know the reason for this. We all understand that Putin invaded Ukraine, pushed up energy prices, pushed up inflation. We mustn't chase that inflation. Otherwise, we won't get it out of the system, which in a year's time, we will have seen it fallen to half the current level, according to the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility. We want to see that happen because inflation's really the evil that we all need to defeat for the benefit of the whole of society.
Yeah, although, you know, the unions disagree with you and they are starting to square up to this government. Certainly you weren't particularly engaged with the transport unions when you were Transport Secretary. Jake Berry, the former Tory party chair, yesterday saying that was a big mistake by you, and your successor is now having conversations with Mick Lynch and the like. In hindsight, do you think that you should have engaged with the unions sooner and we wouldn't have been in this position?
Of course, the unions were sort of constantly saying we need to speak, although the actual discussion needs to be between the employer and the unions themselves. And as has rather been demonstrated, in fact, the last two transport secretaries, I was actually Transport Secretary 3 ago, have both spoken to the unions. It doesn't appear to have stopped them from announcing a whole new set of strikes. So it rather proves the point that we've all been making, myself and the current Transport Secretary included, which is the only way to resolve these strikes is for the unions and the management, the rail operators, Network Rail, to discuss these things, and rather brings a lie to the idea that if only we sat down and spoke, this would all be over, as the unions have been claiming. That simply is not true, because they are still striking.
Yeah, on the contrary, if you had sat down and talked to them, perhaps we wouldn't be in this position.
Well, why would that be the case? We're still in that position with the last couple
why
of...
Why is the present Transport Secretary saying that he will sit down and talk to them now, and you just didn't want to entertain them, they said?
Because the only resolution to this is between the management and the...
So you shouldn't be chatting to them?
But I mean, it's not that you shouldn't. And actually, I had spoken to Mick Lynch in the past as the boss of the RMT. It's simply that it doesn't seem to resolve it one way or the other. And I can prove that point because the last couple of transport secretaries have spoken to them. I had a situation where I allowed the unions and the management, who are the only people who can resolve this, to speak directly. Actually, it transpires it doesn't matter which way you go around this. The unions seem absolutely intent on causing the maximum disruption to hardworking people in this country. It's time for them to stop grandstanding and get this thing settled. Fortunately, actually, when it comes to rail, there are lots of modernisations that could be carried out, lots of them, which could help to pay for their increase. But they don't want to modernise. They want to keep stuck in the 1970s and before, rather than modernise the railway. And that's a great shame, because it's costing all passengers a lot because of that intransigence.
Okay. Talk to me about what's going on in China. You've obviously seen the images overnight. Huge instability there. Biggest protest since Tiananmen Square is what we're saying here on Sky News this morning. What does that instability mean for us as a nation?
Well, look, we're watching very carefully indeed to see what's happening there. It's a reminder, I think many of us will have forgotten, because we haven't been in lockdown for, well, over a year now, I guess, that it's actually still going on there. And it's a reminder that the way we got out of the situation was by having mass vaccinations pioneered here in the UK with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, with the UK being the first to vaccinate and therefore the first major economy to come out of lockdown. They didn't follow that approach in China. Instead, they've gone for a zero COVID, still back in the days where we'll remember it when we were in lockdown here, and people are clearly becoming impatient. Watching with concern, because I think it's very important for the question of stability, that, for example, vaccinations is the way forward to enable societies to unlock.
Yeah, but how concerned are we about that instability? I mean, I know that the boss is going to be speaking at the Guildhall tonight, and he's going to be talking about robust pragmatism, and that's what we need to do to stand up to the likes of China and Russia. I wonder how that robust pragmatism actually works, though, when we're seeing protesters and accredited journalists being arrested and beaten.
Well, there can be absolutely no excuse whatsoever for journalists who are simply covering the process going on for being beaten by the police. I know that's of considerable concern. But with regard to the wider issue, can you imagine, had we been locked down for another year, had we not acted so quickly and managed to mass vaccinate people in this country? When I see those pictures, it sort of takes you back to the worst days a couple of years ago of lockdown, and people are clearly getting pretty fed up about it. But in terms of our attitude towards China, it will be that robust pragmatism. It will always be saying that China's a reality, but we always need to remind ourselves that they do not run the same system of democracy that we're fortunate to live under.
Tell me about your energy saving campaign that you're going to launch today. Is this the same one that Liz Truss said that we weren't going to do?
Well, all I know is about the campaign I am launching, which is £1 billion to both help people improve.
That's not money, though, is it?
Well, that's billions on top of 6.6 billion that's been spent before. So this money is for people who've not been able to benefit from the previous schemes, and will help hundreds of thousands of homes. But in addition, I'm also announcing that we're going to be helping just to inform people better about how they can save energy. One of the tips, by the way, is something I've actually been able to use at home. It's called the boiler flow rate, and it's actually on your boiler where you can turn the temperature down, which is often set too high at 75 degrees, for example, to 60 degrees. This is not your thermostat. This is in the boiler itself, and it can potentially save you a lot of money on your energy costs each year. So it's actually simple tips like that, which we'll be announcing, and there's an £18 million campaign to back that as well. So lots of practical help, physically improving people's homes, and also tips to make sure that people are able to save themselves money by being more efficient in the homes.
Onshore wind, where are you on that at the moment?
Well, we already have a lot of onshore wind in this country. We have the world's most offshore wind of any country in the world. I think offshore has the potential to produce really...
onshore?
We already have quite a lot of onshore wind, and we're
Should we
in
have
favour
any more?
There will be more over time, but particularly where communities are in favour of it. And that is, I think, the key test for onshore wind, giving some benefit to communities locally. And that's always been a principle for us for quite some time now.
Looks as though Simon Clarke, former Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, who is now the Levelling Up Secretary, both forcing the government's hand on onshore wind. And Simon Clarke saying they're 5 MPs away from forcing the government to do what they want.
I don't recognise it in those terms at all. Simon Clarke has put in an amendment, which I haven't studied all the ramifications of yet, but actually essentially saying exactly what I said to you, which is that local people ought to have a very, very keen say in this, which is indeed government policy. There are always different ways to skin a cat, as it were, but we'll have a close look at what's being proposed. But
sounds like the government might be backing down on this one.
No, exactly what we've said all along. In fact, Rishi Sunak said the other week, where onshore happens, it needs to happen with local
He said he was against it. He said he was against any further onshore wind. He said that to me during the summer.
I think you're being far too black and white about this. I've always said... Yeah,
I absolutely pressed him on it, and he said he was against it. He said he'd misspoken the day before, and he said he was against onshore wind.
So I've always said, and indeed he has always said, where onshore wind happens, it needs to happen with local consent. What is being proposed is something which would guarantee that local consent. As I say, I haven't studied all the ramifications of that in terms of the planning changes, but to present it as some sort of massive gulf is completely untrue. We need, and I'll be talking about this more later in the week. I've just spoken to you about measures to reduce energy use. We also need to make sure that we produce more energy.
Okay.
And we'll be doing that.
I wonder if I could ask you 2 very quick questions. I know you've got to flee in just a moment. You were Home Secretary. You were Home Secretary for 6 days, I think I'm right in saying. I'm hearing that David Davis is writing to the Prime Minister to say that anyone from safe countries like Albania should summarily have their applications rejected. Do you agree?
So what I'd say is, I have looked at this issue in some detail because of being briefly Home Secretary. Where countries are not, where people's lives are not at risk, then clearly, and there isn't a case for asylum, then clearly that should be dealt with quickly and efficiently. And that's what I'd say on that issue. I'm so sorry, but I actually have one of your rival broadcasters calling, Kay, and I need to take their call. I think we're over time.
OK, we do have 12 minutes with you, don't we? We've done 12 minutes and 4 seconds. So let me just ask you in another 10 seconds, Matt Hancock, should he be able to be back with the Tory whip now?
Look, I don't think he should have gone to the jungle in the first place. And, it's often said politics is, or show business for ugly people. He should be back here with us ugly people in Parliament doing the job for his constituents. And that's what I think he should have done all
I've
along.
always found you rather dashing, actually, Mr. Shapps. So it's lovely to talk to you as always. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Top stories for you this morning. And there have been clashes and arrests in Shanghai during unprecedented protests across China against the country's COVID restrictions. Hearing there from Mr. Shapps that he's very much, as a member of the government, keeping an eye on that. The Business Secretary saying that the only way to resolve strikes is for the unions to talk directly to management, but described inflation as an evil that we all need to defeat. And out of the jungle and heading home, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock facing questions about his political future after he finishes third on I'm a Celebrity. Tamara is here. Thoughts this morning, Tamara? Good morning.
Morning, Kay. Well, Rishi Sunak's facing various rebellions from all sides within his own party, and I think we've got an indication there from Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary, that he may be preparing to give in on a rebellion about onshore wind farms. I remember very well when he spoke to you during the leadership campaign. He said he didn't think we need any more onshore wind farms, that plans to relax the ban that was brought in by David Cameron. I remember there was a big outcry, and David Cameron said we should restrict onshore wind. He said plans to relax that were wrong, and he wasn't going to go ahead with it. That was a difference between him and Liz Truss. Now, some Conservatives, including Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, various other former cabinet ministers now causing trouble on the backbenches, are trying to bring onshore wind back. They say it's good for growth, good for the environment and good for homegrown energy. And I think Grant Shapps there saying, I think we're all trying to achieve the same thing, make sure local people are happy with it, seem to open the way to a compromise. And with Rishi Sunak already having to pull some legislation to do with building more homes because a lot of Tories were angry about it, you can see that he's facing so many difficult battles with his party. Is he going to duck another one? And therefore, how much of what Rishi Sunak told us in the summer that he was going to do is actually going to happen?
Yeah, let's wait and see. Also, I mean, obviously, we're being a little bit flippant there about Matt Hancock, but it's a very real possibility that he might not be able to stand as an MP, a Tory MP, at the next election. There's a deadline on the 5th of December.
That's right. How could the morning go past without us talking about Matt Hancock there with a frog on his head? Came third.
I think it's a toad,
last
actually.
Night, it's a toad. Sorry, I do apologise. So he came third last night. Who would have predicted that at the very beginning? Had the whip, of course, withdrawn. He will need to get it back. First of all, that would be the first battle. Now, Nadine Dorries, back 10 years ago or so, when she went on the programme, she did get the whip back when she returned. So that will be his first battle. Suggestions in the papers this morning that he's looking to leave politics, slapped down by a spokesperson for Matt Hancock, I can tell you. They say that it's not true that he is leaving politics and is already contacting PR companies. They say that a spokesperson told us he has no intention of standing down or stepping away, and he hasn't had any conversations with any PR companies. As to confirmation about whether he wants to stand at the next election, the reason we've seen so many Tories of the last few days saying they don't want to stand is because the 5th of December is when they have to decide, and some of them are having their seats affected by changes to the boundaries, so the exact seat they stood in may not exist in the same form. I think Matt Hancock's constituency is one of those, so we'll watch this space on that, but they say that he has no intention of standing down right now. He's continuing until the next election.
OK, for now, tomorrow, thank you. Let's have a look at the morning's papers for you, should we? Starting with the Financial Times this morning, leading with the protests in Shanghai as police struggle to disperse large crowds in a growing wave of discontent at China's zero-tolerance COVID policies. An image of the protests is on the Times front page, but the paper leads with plans to bring in army personnel to help with walkouts as NHS strike action looms. The Business Secretary saying he has no knowledge of that. Guardian saying that Brexit has worsened the NHS's shortages of doctors, leading to more than 4,000 European doctors choosing not to work in the UK. And finally, The Sun, claiming there have been secret talks to get Matt Hancock out of politics and into showbiz. That's been rubbished by his team this morning, according to Tomorrow. To the World Cup in Qatar now, where there have been more protests and Germany has still not won a game, although, you know, to be fair, they did play quite well last night. They were saved from defeat against Spain by that late goal, but the Germans are currently bottom of their group and will need to win their last match to have a hope of going through to the knockout stages. Earlier, Morocco stunned Belgium, beating them 2-0. The team ranked second in the world may now need to beat Croatia in a Group F showdown to progress to the last 16. England and Wales will be getting their final training sessions in before the two teams face off tomorrow night in one of sport's oldest rivalries. Alistair standing by for us in Doha. It's the game that everybody here in the UK is waiting to see. Alistair, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm sure it will divide households in the UK and it'll be watched by millions back at home. It'll be watched by thousands of Welsh and English fans who are here in Doha as well. It is a crucial match, certainly for the Welsh. They have to beat England and hope that the results in the other game between the United States and Iran go their way. It is an uphill challenge for Wales, but no injury concerns that we know of. There'll be media conferences later for both teams, and they will hope that with a good degree of support behind them in the stadium and the fact that, you know, it's a World Cup and that we've seen a number of upsets so far, their hope will be that they can do the same against England. As for England, again, they're in training today. There is a little bit of pressure on Gareth Bale to make some changes. After that draw against the United States, when England were booed off the field, the England manager says that he's not concerned. Group stages rarely go smoothly. But Harry Kane's got a little bit of a knock on his ankle, so there might be temptation just to rest him for the latter stages. England's qualification, incidentally, is not absolutely guaranteed, but things need to go badly wrong wrong for them not to qualify. And the other one is Phil Foden, who a lot of people want to see come into the team to add a bit of spark in the side. And so it might be that with England sitting in a good position at the top of the group, Gareth Southgate decides to bring in a few new faces tomorrow.
OK, for now, thank you. Looking at some of today's other headlines for you now. Riots broke out in several Belgian and Dutch cities after Morocco beat Belgium in that match we mentioned a moment ago. Police arrested about a dozen people in Brussels and held 8 more in the northern city of Antwerp. 2 police officers were injured when they were pelted with fireworks and glass in the Dutch port city of Rotterdam. A landslide has killed at least 14 people who were attending a funeral in Cameroon. Local officials say the service was taking place on a football pitch in the country's capital, one of the wettest cities in Africa. A vigil has been held for the 6 people killed in a mass shooting at a Walmart store in Virginia last week. Local Congressman Robert Cortez Scott said more needs to be done to solve America's problems with gun crime.
Chesapeake now joins a list of all too many communities forced to bear the unbearable. Now we know we can do better. There's no other country suffers gun violence like America, and so we need to stand up and do something about this problem.
Police have expressed their despair at the deaths of 2 more teenagers from knife crime after another weekend of violence in the capital. 16-year-olds Kern Solanki and Charlie Bartolo were found with stab wounds in southeast London yesterday. Police say their deaths are linked. And in separate incidents, 1 man was shot in South London and another died after a street fight. Emma has more.
Silently, a steady stream of teenagers came to mourn, laying flowers at the scene of yet another fatal stabbing in the capital. Just a mile away from this estate in Thamesmead, police stood guard at the location of a second murder, this time in Abbey Wood. The boys, aged just 16, were stabbed within a matter of minutes of each other.
Homicide colleagues are investigating and are treating the 2 murders as linked. I can assure everybody affected by these murders that skilled detectives will work tirelessly to discover what happened and provide answers to the young victims and families.
The 999 calls began coming in at around 5:10 on Saturday afternoon. Paramedics attempted to save the boys' lives, but both were pronounced dead on the street. They've been named by police as Kiani Solanki, who was killed in Thamesmead, and Charlie Bartolo. By mid-afternoon, dozens of people had gathered close to the scene in Abbey Wood to remember yet another young life lost. They lit candles and placed them next to the flowers, and balloons were released into the sky. For both communities, it's been an unbearable shock.
Ambulance, they try to do their best, and I think unfortunately they have to lose the boy. But then it's very sad, and since then all the people in the community will be mourning the boy.
The deaths come in yet another weekend of violence across London, despite a targeted effort to tackle knife crime. Figures from the Metropolitan Police show violent crime with a blade was up 15% in October compared to the previous month. Anne-Marie Cousins is the local councillor for Abbey Wood.
2 16-year-olds, they're babes. 2 16-year-olds. Think about that.
Police want to hear from anyone who saw a dark SUV or 4x4 type vehicle with silver roof bars at either location in the days before the teenagers were stabbed, as their families become the latest left to mourn an unbearable loss in an epidemic of violence. Emma Birchley, Sky News, South East London.
Returning now to the protests that have been taking place in cities across China over the country's repeated COVID lockdowns and strict restrictions. Joined now by Victor Gao. He's a businessman and commentator who previously worked as an English language interpreter for the former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning.
Thank you for having me.
What's your interpretation of what is happening at the moment? Is it exhaustion, frustration, both?
First of all, it is very rare for many cities in China to witness demonstrations almost at the same time. Secondly, the protests are very much focused on the dynamic zero COVID policy, that China has practiced for the past 3 years. Now, I would say China is in the transition period, moving from strict lockdown, quarantine, etc., to a more flexible paradigm going forward. Originally, our goal is to minimize deaths and infections. Now, I think we need to pursue two goals: to minimize deaths and infections on the one hand, but also to make sure that people's daily life and work process will be less impacted or disrupted by the COVID policies. Now, I think the protesters demand that they get complete freedom. They have legitimate reasons for calling for that. On the other hand, I hope they will also realize that the anti-COVID policy is not against any people or person. It is really against the virus. And China has already achieved unprecedented, spectacular achievements of minimizing deaths and infections among the Chinese people during the past 3 years. And now we need to do whatever we can to make sure that the transition to the new roadmap will be less costly going forward.
So why are the Chinese people demonstrating in such numbers and in a way that we have not seen for a generation?
You're right. I think many people are inconvenienced and many people suffer from the lockdowns or repeated lockdowns, etc. In that sense, they have legitimate reasons to demand greater freedom and greater, more targeted policies to prevent the infections or the deaths among the people. On the other hand, I think they do not fully understand why the dynamic zero COVID policy has been introduced and practiced for the past 3 years at the same time. Because ultimately, the fact that we are all alive and many of us are still healthy is because of the dynamic zero COVID policy itself. Because this has really prevented massive amount of infections among the Chinese people, minimizing the deaths among the Chinese people. I think the government need to communicate to the people more eloquently about what they have been doing for the past 3 years and the reason why there are so many disruptions and inconveniences. And if there are corruptions involved in testing, for example, making illegitimate money from the testings, etc., they need to be brought to justice. So I think lots of things need to be done at the same time. But I personally would say that the Chinese government and the whole Chinese nation have really made a spectacular achievement in minimizing deaths and infections for the past 3 years. It's time for us to move on to a better paradigm in achieving two goals rather than only one goal.
It's good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. More than 50 Conservative MPs have written to the Prime Minister calling for a change to modern slavery laws to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel in small boats. Joined now by one of the signatories, the former Brexit Secretary David Davis. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. What do you want to see happen?
Well, what's happening at the moment, got 12,000 Albanians in 1 year from a safe country. You know, it's a member of the European Convention on Human Rights, as we are. And I want two things to happen. We want two things to happen. One, such people to be told, you can't claim asylum here immediately, a summary decision on that. There's no argument for asylum from Albania here. Secondly, those who use the human trafficking laws, we should say to them, look, if you have been human trafficked, surely the right answer is to put you back in your own home, in your own village, back in Albania. If you want to process it beyond that, then talk to us after that, but you're going home. The point is to turn the turnaround time for an Albanian landing on our shores from years to days or weeks. And that's the aim, and we think it's possible. If we don't do it, the Home Office is never going to be able to cope with the number of applications. It's already 420 days to get a decision. It'll get longer and longer, and eventually all those decisions will allow people to stay.
See, the Home Office doesn't agree with you because of the 55% of asylum applications by adult Albanians, they've been allowed to stay.
No. What's been happening is if you turn it into two groups, young men, which is the vast majority, and women and children. Women and children have been getting about 85% approval. That's because the Home Office itself has not been interpreting the asylum laws correctly.
So it's the Home Office's fault, not the Albanian?
It's a mixture. No, the end of the day, the blame for this lands with the Albanian gangs who bring them here, not the Albanians themselves, because they're all sorts of fairly innocent people. It's the Albanian gangs that bring them here. But the simple truth is that the Home Office is interpreting asylum laws to say if you are in Albania, not if the government is oppressing you, which is what asylum laws are like. So you've been talking about China. If somebody came from China saying, my government's going to kill me, we give them asylum. But if they're facing gangsters, criminal activities and so on in their own country, that's a misinterpretation of the asylum laws. It was never designed for that.
Well, interestingly, the Albanian Prime Minister saying that he's not having Albanians being scapegoated because of failed policy here in the UK.
Well, I mean, I'm not scapegoating the individual Albanians. What I'm saying is that the gangs, before you set off across the channel, if you're a migrant, the Albanians gangs brief them on how to use loopholes in our law. What I want to do is to close those loopholes. So if you like, I'm agreeing with the Albanian Prime Minister. We need to fix our own problem. He needs to fix some too in terms of trafficking out of his country.
OK, you talk about people not being able to come here if they've come from a safe country. Surely that means France?
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, there's a secondary issue here, which we haven't addressed in this because it's been going on for years and nobody seems to be able to resolve it, and that is that any asylum seeker's real primary right is to be able to stop in the first safe country they arrive in, right? So that could be France. In this case, if they've crossed Europe, it's about 6 other countries, right? But we can't enforce that. But what we can do is say, you're an Albanian, you go back to Albania.
Isn't that the problem, though, that we can't enforce that? Isn't that where the problem lies?
Oh, well, there are several links in this problem. What we're
Why are you not addressing that one as well?
Well, because we're focusing on the one that's quickest to fix. I mean, this one, if the government puts through emergency legislation, very, very unusually, I mean, I normally oppose emergency legislation, but very, very unusually, there's a very, very strong argument for doing this. It'll be a very short bill. It will go through, and basically we could say to the Albanian population now, anybody else who comes across the channel will be sent back. And when that starts to happen, there's no bigger deterrent. Remember, the Home Office's argument on the Rwanda policy, for example, is this is a deterrent. Think, there's no bigger deterrent than if somebody in your village pays thousands of pounds to a human trafficker and then ends up back in the village 3 weeks later.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Rwanda, because how's that working out for this government?
Well, I'm not a fan of Rwanda. I mean, I've got to be careful because I don't. Not everybody who signed the letter agrees with me on that. But I'm not a fan of Rwanda policy because we've spent 140 million, and the indications are that even if it works at all, it won't take more than 200 people. It's a bad idea. It won't work.
Yeah, but my point is that it's a piece of legislation that was put through the House of Commons by this government, and it has not been successful. Why do you think emergency legislation, which is rushed through by its very description, is going to be any more effective?
Because this addresses the two main loopholes that are used by people traffickers to bring people into Britain illegally. That's what it does. There are two main loopholes. One is in our asylum law, one is in our trafficking law. And interestingly, in November of 2021, I think it was, Sweden looked at this and said, we're going to stop anybody claiming asylum from a safe country, in this case Albania. And you know what? They've approved 0 since, and nobody's taken them to court.
Talk to me about the Tory exodus while I've got you. A lot of youngsters, I'll describe them as that, Diana Davison particularly. I mean, she wasn't even born when you became an MP.
I'll say everybody's a youngster today. I understand, Kay.
What's going on?
Kay, you're a child.
What's going on?
Oh, well, I think some people are deciding they came into politics, they enjoyed it for a while, now they don't. I mean, William Ragg, he said, he had a great time, he's been chairman of a committee and so on. While he's still young enough to have another career, he's going to go and do that. That sort of thing. That sort of thing. I can't tell you the answers to all those. I mean, I'm going to be here till I die in harness, I suspect.
Although, am I right in saying that your constituency is going to be affected by boundaries again?
Oh, cut to bits again.
Is it?
Yeah, third time. I mean, I end up with about half of my existing constituency. But what's been the case since, since over a decade, is we've got, in the eyes of the Boundary Commission at least, one too many MPs for what was the old Humberside. That's East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And so they had to shrink them down, and so one will go.
And the Boundary Change Commission, do you think that they have the best interests of your constituents and others in mind when they come up with these new boundaries?
Well, I'm sure they intend to. Whether they get it exactly right, well, there's a consultation process. We are actually currently engaged in a consultation process on that, and indeed, I've talked to them. I will be writing to them rather about one component of my current constituency to try and ensure that it stays together rather than get broken up and sent to this piece and that piece.
Can I ask you about wind farms? Where are you on that?
I'm not in favour of this so-called Tory rebellion in favour of liberalising the law on wind farms.
Is that because you're a NIMBY?
I've got one right next to, I mean, nearly as close as the camera to my house. But you know,
Would you rather it wasn't there?
Yes, frankly, but you know, it ruins the skyline. But so what? The more important point here is that we've got offshore wind farms now coming. We've got to be sure that when we go towards hitting net zero, that we do it in a way that takes the population with us, takes the nation with us, and that applies to whether it's wind farms or massive solar farms. Now that we're covering not half the country, but great tranches of the country in solar farms. Fine, let's go down that route, but let's make it at least responsive to the ideas of local people.
Before I let you go, it would appear that the way for Conservative MPs to be popular is to go on to I'm a Celebrity. Do you think that's what Rishi Sunak's are doing?
No, certainly not. No. I mean, look, I've had to spend time in a jungle eating horrible things, but never on television, and I wouldn't recommend it.
It's good to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning.
My
I really
pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you.